Okay. Okay, kicking off session 3 today. And before we get into it, I thought I would do a quick little recap from last week. As last week's session, I did not listen back to it, but in my opinion, it wasn't as clear as it could have been. And I thought I would just highlight a few points that I wanted to make with chapter 2 on movement ability. And the first one being that movement control can be translated from a more technical perspective into motor control. And motor control is our ability to move our body with control into different forms, shapes, and navigating this from our brain into our nervous system, and then into the musculature in order to create these different movement patterns that we care about. Now, our brain, of course, is part of our central nervous system, and the peripheral nervous system is that which allows us to get access, innervation into the musculature, and through contraction and relaxation, being able to create motion. So that's the first point, is that movement ability is our capacity to move from a neurological perspective. And this all starting in the brain. And something that is interesting to keep in mind is that our brain has really evolved not for movement, but through movement. And this is something that we can dive into a little bit more in the future, but something to keep in mind. The second thing about movement ability is that we are working on developing our ability to move through progressions. And some of these progressions can be studied by looking at the basic shapes that we adopt in space when we move. And as we addressed last week, contextual movement is key, as the movement that happens in a specific context, in a specific environment, is the movement that is defined, and thus is the movement that we can work with. What am I referring to here? Well, if you're bending over to pick up your kid or grocery bags, it may be slightly different than bending over to pick up a barbell for a 1-rep max. This nuance in context is what defines a movement, not only from its from the geometrical shapes that we adopt, but also from the physiological adaptations that we have to pull from in order to move in specific ways. And by becoming aware of this, we can start to create progressions. The other concept that we talked about last week was this notion that movement ability, when we start to think about it, it starts from the spine. And the reason it starts from the spine is because within the spine is our central nervous system, and then it works into our extremities. And by simply working on challenging stability, form, we can start to develop, and this is from the core, from the global perspective, we can start to develop a foundation that carries over into our ability to move. And then we talked about the different shapes. We talked about standing. We talked about lying down. We talked about lying down facing up. We talked about lying down facing up and in a hollow body position, and why these shapes are powerful to work with. And then we talked about facing down. And we talked about adopting that into not only a push-up position, for example, but also an arch position or a Superman position. And then not only holding static positions, but adding movement. And when adding movement, realizing that all movement has a push and a pull, and that when we look at it from a pushing perspective, that's where we can establish a stronger base, and this base carrying over into pulling movements. And when we look at them together, pushing and pulling create a cycle, a wheel, that allows us to move from one movement, one pattern to the next, whether it's within the same mechanical pattern or in different ones. example, walking is the same movement pattern over and over again until you decide to maybe turn a corner, or you start walking uphill or downhill. Or if you think about running, applied to something like tumbling and gymnastics, your movement pattern will change from running to doing a hurdle to doing a cartwheel or a roundoff to doing a back handspring, and then maybe a flip at the end. And the flip may be in an extended position, a tucked position. It may have a twist or not a twist. If it's in an action sports fashion, maybe you're doing it off axis. So all of a sudden, there's variety that comes from changing these movement patterns. And when looking at it at the micro level, at the pictures that we take throughout a movement pattern, there we can look at pushing and pulling as the foundation for that. And ultimately, the reason we care about all this is because we are trying to develop two things. One, movement strength, and two, a skill. Movement strength being our capacity to move, and our capacity to move being looked at from a local perspective. The local perspective is the joints, the articulations, and then the skill is looking at it from a global perspective, where movement strength and skill are different because movement strength is our capacity to move. It's our ability to get into shapes, and our skill is our ability to apply our capacity to get into those shapes. And this is where the question of how strong do you need to be to perform a pistol squat, for example, is always going to be answered with strong enough. And the reason it's strong enough is because there's no metric other than the ability to being able to get into that shape. And this is where movement strength becomes skill, and where skill becomes a progression. And why do we care about skill as a progression? Because when we can look at movement from a skill perspective, what we are creating is the ability to transfer any movement pattern into another. In other words, every movement pattern serves as a foundation for building the next. That's what we saw in movement ability. And I know that it is complicated, but worry not, because at the end of today's session, I'm going to share a video with you in the description where I recap chapter 1, 2, and 3 of the book in a way that maybe it all comes into a clearer picture that you can utilize and translate into what you want to get out of these sessions together with the reading of freestyle. Now, getting into this week's chapter, what we're talking about is, if you remember where we finished, we're talking about progressions. Now, in these progressions, one of the things that we want to make sure that we do is that we realize that a progression is really here to get us where we want to go. So the first thing we need to do is we need to remember, where is it we at least think we want to go? And where we think we want to go is the title that you all came up with for your own freestyle book. So I want you to remember that as I'm speaking about today's content. And as we are going through today's content, I also want you to start to not only think about where you are going, but how it feels to be where you are going. And this now is in your physical practice. In addition to that, if you are somebody that not only moves, but encourages or guides other people to move, I want you to think about, how are you going to share with other people, with the people that you guide, the people that you coach, why these concepts are important. And what you will probably realize is that these concepts are concepts that, when we guide others, are usually concepts that are not spoken about. We don't talk about them, they just happen. In fact, I just saw a video that Sarah, who's here, tagged me on just now, that she posted on her Instagram, where she was talking about, well, she was performing and expressing the concept of how simple it is to guide people through motion, and that it doesn't require us to give them all the details, give the people that we're working on all the details. It just requires us to share the general notion of what the sensation should be and what the expression of that sensation should be. And when doing that, we can arrive at very technical outcomes. We can arrive at very technical expressions. And this being the key of freestyle is that, yes, we can study it. Yes, we can break it down into a million parts. But at the end of the day, it all happens at once. And thus, it can't really be talked about. It can't really be expressed clearly. It's something that just is. And the reason we are breaking it down into our parts is because we, as human beings, we need to, at times, compartmentalize ideas, compartmentalize concepts in order to direct them where we see it could help in meeting a need. So that's what we're going to do today with chapter 3 here. We're going to get into the concept of progressions. And this chapter of progression, I open up with this quote that I use very often, which is that the best progression will ramp up the most novice and challenge the most advanced. I think I mentioned this quote last week. But what does this mean? This means that you can work with anybody. You can be anybody. And if you are able to prescribe, to give yourself, to give others something that is universal in nature, something that is true for many, it can, through translation, become individualized, become specific. And this is really, really powerful because this is what allows you to become a master. And a master is one who has never arrived, but is rather always evolving, always walking a path. And the steps that one takes looks like a practice, a method. It looks like CrossFit. It looks like gymnastics. It looks like free running. It looks like breakdancing. It looks like kettlebells, yoga, dance. It looks like different dance expressions. This right here is the essence of that. And where it gets exciting is when you participate in a process, in a method, in a practice, without being bound to the outcome. And some of you may be thinking, well, how do you do that if you are somebody who wants to be number one? How do you become the best in the world at something without caring about the outcome? Well, that's where we have to become very careful, full of care of the process. And the process is our adherence to a progression, and the progression being a lifestyle. And this lifestyle being one that is ever changing according to what you need in this very moment. What does this mean? Well, if you begin the journey towards becoming the best in the world at anything, today, whoever you are today is not who you will be tomorrow. Thus, your needs tomorrow are going to be slightly different, and you have to be able to acknowledge those. And the never-ending process of acknowledging your needs every step of the way is the secret ingredient of being able to freestyle, which is taking what you have in this very moment and translating it into that which you need. In other words, that which you are becoming. So here in this part of the book, I talk about how I taught Jason Khalipa how to do a backflip. And Jason Khalipa, he won the CrossFit Games in 2008. And nothing against Jason Khalipa, but in my opinion, he's not the most athletic individual I've ever met. But he is a very hardworking individual, and he is very willing. Thus, he's able to adhere to a progression really well, evolve, and thus become the best. And this is where athleticism is something that can be looked at, defined in many different ways. The way that I think about it is as our ability to apply ourselves in any context. And if we look at it from that perspective, not only from the movement perspective, but also from the mental and emotional perspective, Jason Khalipa is extremely athletic. And something that was fun to do with Jason Khalipa was learning how to do a backflip in the context of his practice as a CrossFitter, and doing it in two ways. One, saying, let's do it as fast as we can. That's one of the concepts of CrossFit is being able to do things in a certain span of time, and this being intensity, or defined as intensity. And also doing it from a movement perspective, which I did by telling Jason to break down the movement, in this case the backflip, into two movement patterns. One, jumping and landing, which he does if he does a box jump, or if he's doing any kind of Olympic weightlifting. And two, the second movement being a knees to elbows. And this knees to elbows being that which will produce the rotation that will get him to perform the backflip. So the jumping and landing being his starting and finishing positions, and then the knees to elbows being his backflip. And in doing this, creating a very simple movement progression that led him to achieving being able to do a backflip, I think, within 9 minutes. You can watch the video online. It's somewhere on YouTube. Just look up Carl and Jason backflip and you'll see it there. So that's just a fun little story that shares the power of skill transfer, and how skill transfer becomes the road, let's call it, becomes the road towards understanding progressions. Now, when we look at progressions, there are three types of progressions that I think it's important to acknowledge. The first one is a natural progression. The second one is a formal progression. And the third one is a creative progression. Now, a natural progression is the progression that occurs without conscious influence. Meaning you put somebody or some living being in an environment, and that living being will adapt to that environment. And the adaptation will have a unique expression. For example, in CrossFit, the natural progression that led people to perform kipping pull-ups was the one of placing an individual in an environment where one had to perform pull-ups as fast as possible, and there were no rules more than getting one's chin over the bar and extending the elbows at the bottom, and thus producing a little kick, a little swing, and this kick and the swing becoming a kipping pull-up. That's a natural progression. Now, when you look over a group of people who have adapted into performing these kipping pull-ups, you can start to observe that there are certain patterns that work better than others, or that are prevalent. And for example, you can perform a kipping pull-up by doing like a frog kick, which is just tucking your legs and kicking up, or you can perform a kipping pull-up by swinging from an arch position to a hollow body position and getting your chin over the bar. Or you can perform combinations of those. Noticing that a natural progression leads to specific types of movement patterns allows us to observe them and now move into what we call a formal progression. And the formal progression is the one where you take that which you have observed that has progressed naturally, and now you teach it, you share it with others. In other words, instead of just saying, okay, go ahead and do pull-ups as fast as you can, you tell people, if you want to do pull-ups as fast as you can, here are 3 ways of doing it. You can do a kipping pull-up, you can do a swinging kipping pull-up, or you can do a combination of both of those. That formality, what it does is it adds speed to a progression. it gets you there quicker. In other words, a natural progression is kind of slow. A formal progression is the hockey stick. It's when everything becomes very clear. Now, it gets to a point where that hockey stick in that progression goes up, 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 up so much that it becomes so specific, so narrow, that it produces something that we do intuitively as human beings. And this is our creative expression. It allows us to produce creative, new ways, innovative ways of expressing a movement pattern. And this is where now, all of a sudden, we start to think maybe for a pull-up, could I take this pull-up and get it over the bar? Could I turn that into a muscle-up? Could I take that muscle-up and apply it to a set of rings? Can I take that muscle-up, apply it to a wall? Can I start to use my legs in different ways to climb over a wall? And here, all of a sudden, getting this bigger expansion into new movement expressions, new specific movement expressions. And what's interesting about the creative progression is that the creative progression is natural. Thus, natural progressions and creative progressions are almost the same. The difference is that a natural progression happens unconsciously, a creative progression happens consciously. And this doesn't mean that when we are creating, we are being deliberate in producing a specific outcome, but rather what is happening is we're being deliberate about being open to a new outcome. That's very different. Sometimes we don't know what we're creating until we're doing it, but we are deliberate about being open to creating it. And what is this? This is breaking free from dogma. This is breaking free from a method. This is breaking free from a practice. And this is the key for being able to freestyle. So what am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about acknowledging that our bodies physically evolve by the influence of our environment and the act of moving towards getting our needs met. In doing so, that's the natural progression. In doing so, we establish effective, efficient practices, ways of doing things. And these effective and efficient practices are what we can teach to others. We can share with others. Moreover, when we look at them, they seem so powerful, so compelling that people adhere, copy, model them. When we live in a formal state of performance, meaning everybody is doing the same thing. This is something that happens in gymnastics all the time. Everybody performs the same elements. You have to get to a point in order for the sport, the practice to evolve, where you become creative. You break free from the mold. And this is something in gymnastics, I'm not sure if I've shared it here, but I'm going to share it now, that occurs approximately every 4 years. And it occurs every 4 years for two reasons. One, the International Federation of Gymnastics says, hey, we need to level you up. So we're going to change either the scoring system, we're going to change the value of each element that you're performing, we're going to change the equipment, and you are going to now evolve, create new ways of expressing your gymnastics through those standards. The other side comes from the individual gymnast. And the individual gymnast may be inspired by movements that they've seen outside of gymnastics and start to incorporate them into gymnastics. For example, gymnastics had a movement called the flare, still has it, which is a movement that you would see on the pommel horse, but you also see gymnasts perform on the floor. Break dancers started learning how to do these flares, And these flares, as they evolved in breakdancing, turned into something called an air flare, which is the same flare movement, but instead of performed forward, it's performed backward. Now, if you have no clue what I'm talking about, I would suggest that you go in to YouTube and just go check out flares versus air flares, and you'll see the difference there. Those air flares did not exist in gymnastics until I think it was in 2000 or 2004. An American gymnast who had a twin, the Ham brothers, incorporated the air flares into gymnastics, inspired by breakdancing. And all of a sudden, now it's a standardized element that you can perform in gymnastics. So this is where the creative progression comes into play, and it's extremely important to see a sport evolve. So I want you to simply become aware of these types of progressions and how they are showing up in your practice and in the way that maybe you're teaching your practice. Now, in order to be able to move through a progression, it's important that we have some sort of framework. And the basic framework of a progression is first and foremost having a purpose or a goal. So asking yourself, why am I moving? For what am I moving? The second element of this framework is having a measuring tape, meaning having a tool that allows you to measure your performance or your movement ability. So I want you to really think about, how do you measure your performance? How are you asking those that you're working with to measure their performance? When you have a metric, a way of measuring your performance, the final aspect of this framework is having the ability to create a roadmap. And this roadmap is a method. And the beauty of these roadmaps, when you look at it from a freestyle perspective, is that they can be molded in any way that you would like. My suggestion is that you mold them in a way that allows yourself and each individual that you work with to adhere to that roadmap in a way that it produces the best outcomes. And this is why having a purpose or a goal is important, and why having something to measure your movement towards that purpose and goal is key. Now, I have this little quote here, which is that no matter how advanced you are as an athlete or mover, the best way to keep improving is to master the basics. So what are the basics really? Well, the basics are the most universal movement patterns. And the most universal movement patterns are the ones that when you look around the world, we are all participating in. And this goes back to something that Sarah was actually sharing in her little reel or IG post. She was talking about walking. And why would we make walking so complicated if we're teaching it? There's no need. There's something there that is so basic, so simple, so innate that we need to allow that innateness of walking to be the foundation. And through that foundation, through that innateness, start to peel back the layers that will allow us to see that which needs to be addressed or worked on. And doing this by addressing that which, when changed, when specifically tweaked, will produce the most positive outcome. And this pulls us back to the importance of having a goal or a purpose. Now, if you see the little drawing here of those dots, it's like a little figure there. What that is representing a great highway, okay? These little dots are representing a great highway. And each one of those dots is a step on that highway. And you can look at that green line that is drawn as the individual path that you're following. And the gray line that is in the middle as the most direct path. a lot of times we get caught in the most direct way of doing things. We get caught in this sense that we need to move from point A to point B in a straight line, when in reality, we're all going to navigate this great highway in very unique ways. And thus, we need to be open to the twists and turns that come with a progression. So when you read this chapter, I want you to simply be aware that when we are creating progressions, there's an infinite number of ways to progress through learning a movement pattern or perfecting a movement pattern, becoming who you want to become. And in acknowledging this, starting to see how to get us into the most optimal, the positions and the movements with the most mechanical advantage to move us in the direction that we want to go towards our goal. In order to do this, it's important that we acknowledge different principles for progression. And when I say do this, I mean navigate this universal highway in our unique way, in our very specific pathway. And these principles, as you can see here, the first one being the principle of pushing and pulling. And if you remember what I talked about last week, you remember that pushing, when we think about progressions, comes before pulling. Now, why is this? Well, there are several reasons, but I want to start with a very basic one. And the most basic one is if you imagine yourself walking one step after the next. Think about the first step that you take. When you place your foot down on the ground, in that moment that you are taking a step, are you pushing or are you pulling? Well, you could argue that you're doing both. But if you look at the foot that is touching the ground and the leg that it's supporting, that is a push. You are pushing with that step. You are pushing with that foot. As you pick up the leg to take the next step, what are you doing? You are pulling. If you pay attention to how people move, they tend to perform really effective, efficient, beautiful movement patterns when they are pushing. When they are pulling is when they tend to break apart. And this is where, if we want to, for example, learn how to perform a pull-up, and we scale a pull-up into a ring row or a rowing pull, just like you can see in the figure on the top right here of the page, it is important that that movement, that pulling movement, mirrors the pushing movement. This, when I share it here, may seem so obvious, but if you start to look around how people push and pull, you'll start to notice that the mechanics used for pulling tend to be slightly different than their pushing. And in fact, because of the methods and techniques that we use, especially in fitness, where pulling takes precedent over pushing, a lot of people develop movement patterns that limit their ability to push, thus making them, quotes here, worse movers or less effective, efficient movers. An example that I will start to share when we get into the handstand push-ups here very soon is where the elbow is placed in relationship to a hand. And if you think about, if you just look at the figure here of Mr. Sticks performing a push-up, notice where the elbow is. It's right on top of the wrist. And notice where the shoulder is. If you look at the line from the elbow to the wrist, you'll see a perpendicular line to the ground. That perpendicular line is like a nail. A nail being about to be hammered into a piece of wood. When that nail is perpendicular to the piece of wood and you hit it right on the head, it applies force more effectively and efficiently. Moreover, what ends up happening is that the final product that it produces once the nail is in is cleaner, better, so to speak, than one that comes in an angle. You're probably seeing a nail hammered into a piece of wood in an angle where the head of the nail is kind of sticking out. And maybe you've even walked on a floor that has nails that have a crooked head and caught your sock on it and tore a little hole in the sock. If that's ever happened to you, I want you to think about how that felt when your foot got caught in that little nail, and realize that that feeling of frustration of like, what happened? There's a glitch in the system, how that actually carries over into your movement patterns. Why am I sharing this? Well, if you watch anybody perform a push-up, and I'm just thinking about Campbell right now. He's probably going to see people doing push-ups later today or tomorrow. When you watch them perform a push-up, you'll notice that the elbow tends to be off line with the wrist. The elbow is either pointing back or it's either flaring out, but it doesn't tend to be right on top. And when you start to notice this, you start to see also how their pulling mechanics, let's say they're doing a ring row or a chest to bar pull-up, has exactly the same mechanical fault. And in this case, it's a fault because it's not as effective and as efficient as it could be. And when you start to realize that their pulling mechanics is mirroring their poor pushing mechanics, you realize that their inability to progress from, for example, a pull-up into a muscle-up is not something that should be addressed necessarily in the pull-up itself, but rather in all of their pushing mechanics. And when addressed through the pushing mechanics, all of a sudden opening up a new movement pattern that will translate, that will skill transfer into a pulling pattern. I know this may be a lot because we're looking at it here in a book and through static images, but I'm going to also share a bunch of movement progression videos that I have that I want you to watch so you can see what I'm talking about in motion. So when thinking about progression principles from a pushing and pulling perspective, all I'm saying is look for the most optimal pushing mechanics and then translate that into your pulling. And when you look at your pulling mechanics, make sure that that pulling mechanics is not negatively influencing your pushing mechanics. That's all I'm going to say for now. Read this chapter, read this section, and then next week we can address questions on it. Now, the other principle here is the global versus local principle. What is the global versus local principle? Well, this is the principle that states that when we are thinking about creating progressions, the best way to create a progression is by starting from a global perspective. It's just thinking about the general shapes. Why do we care about the general shapes of the body? Well, because when we think about the general shapes of the body, we're actually addressing the nervous system. We are starting with the central nervous system. And then following that with the local shapes. And if you start to work this way, what you start to realize is that at global levels is where we see the foundation for movement. This is where a snatch, a clean and jerk, a kettlebell swing, a jump, where you're jumping and landing, that all from a global perspective is very similar. From a local perspective, meaning the motion that you are expressing in your extremities is different. Think about a snatch versus a clean and jerk. Different local expressions, different expressions at shoulder, elbow, wrist level, different expressions at hip, knees, ankle level. Globally, the spine is the same. The shapes, stand, squat, is the same. Jump, land is the same. So the principle of global and local is looking at movement from a global perspective first, what's happening generally speaking with the body, and then what is happening with the extremities. That's the local. When we can start with the global, correct things there, and then move towards the local, we can create stronger expressions. Now, here's something interesting. When thinking about the movements within the global perspective of things, the first shape that we want to address is the neutral shape. That is just having a straight line from your head all the way to your toes. The second shape is the flexed shape. Flexed shape or flexion is simply bending forward. It's going from this neutral shape to this shape right here. The third shape is the extension, which is the opposite. Flexion is like a hollow body position. Extension is like an arch position. The fourth shape or movement would be the lateral flexion and extension, which is happening on the frontal plane. It would be twisting in these directions, side to side. And then finally, the fifth shape would be the rotation. And the rotation is spinning around this vertical axis. When we can address movement from a global perspective through those progressions, those shapes, those movements, we can create very accessible, inclusive progressions. Now, this is something that we can get into a little bit in future chapters, but I want you to simply pay attention. When you notice human movement, notice how much time we spend in a neutral shape versus in a flexed shape versus in an extended shape versus in a laterally flexed or extended shape versus in a rotated shape. And you'll see that we spend more time, technically, in a neutral position, and then less in a flexed, less in an extended, less in a laterally flexed and extended, and then finally less in a rotated position. We're going to add a little color to this in a second, but simply pay attention to that, because these shapes also have combinations. And a combination of all of these could be walking. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But walking requires you to be slightly extended. It requires you to resist rotation every time you take a step, thus rotating. And now imagine yourself carrying a briefcase, a bag, a grocery bag, and all of a sudden having to carry load on one side. All of a sudden you're adding a little bit of lateral flexion and extension. Things start to change. Regardless, all I want you to know for now is that the principles for progression, when looking at it from this perspective of global local, the shapes start with neutral first, flex second, extended third, lateral flexion extension fourth, rotation fifth, and finally a combination. Now for the local shapes, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting and maybe a little bit more complicated, but there's also a priority that we can work through. The first one is external rotation. What is external rotation? Well, we talked about this in chapter 1, which is simply rotating, for example, the shoulder outward. In the hip, it is when you squeeze your butt, for example, having the femurs rotating away from the midline. The second movement pattern would be flexion. Flexion is lifting the arm or lifting the leg. The third movement would be extension, which is dropping the arm or dropping the leg behind you. The third movement priority would be adduction. Adduction is towards the midline. The fifth one would be abduction, away from the midline. And the sixth one would be internal rotation, which is moving your shoulders, for example, in towards the midline, turning your toes into a pigeon toe position. These right here, as much as we are putting a hierarchy on them, these shapes right here, as much as we're putting a hierarchy on them, they all happen at the same time. But why are we sharing them in this hierarchy? Well, I'm sharing them in this hierarchy because when you are thinking about addressing movement, correcting movement, finding that which could be the anchor for your success or for your technical failure, if you start by looking at what is happening from an external rotation position first, then flexion, then extension, then adduction, then abduction, and then internal rotation, you'll start to realize that you can affect greater change. And this right now may just sound like something that I'm making up, but with observation and description, which we talked about in chapter 1, you'll start to notice that this is what you naturally do. We naturally do this, intuitively do this when we're addressing our own movement and the movement of others. And I simply want to bring this to your awareness. And actually, one of the reasons we're doing this is because I want to challenge these frameworks. I want you to put them to the test and see whether these frameworks actually are universal or if there's something that needs to be changed. And if so, I would rewrite the book. That's the beauty of it. I would freestyle the book. Okay. Now, the next principle is position over range of motion. What does this mean? Well, let's say we're learning how to squat. If I can understand what a standing position looks like and a squatting position looks like, now I have 2 anchor points to move through. So that's the first thing to think about. Point A, starting, standing. Point B, squatting position. Point C, standing again. That would be a squat. So if I can address movement from position first before movement, now I have a framework to work with. The second one is the movement itself, but thinking about it from a range of motion perspective, and specifically from a mid-range versus end-range perspective. Now, what is mid-range? Mid-range is the movement that happens not at the end of the range of motion of our joints, but rather in the middle of those ranges. And I give 2 examples here with Mr. Sticks, moving in the first one on the left, his shoulders. I think he's a he. I don't know. We call him Mr. Whatever. Sticks. Moving his shoulder from flexion to extension. Mid-range would be that which is outlined with red. It has that little triangle that is has those little red lines. And then end ranges would be all the way overhead and all the way behind the back. Same thing with the hip. Mid-range would be the swing that goes from slight extension to partial flexion of the hip. And then end ranges would be toe to the nose. You've probably seen this in movement culture, how they like to do the nose to toe stretch. And then the end range and extension would be the leg all the way back, almost forming a 90-degree angle between the leg and the upper body. This is something that if you have watched anybody perform any stretches in rhythmic gymnastics, they hit these positions quite often. But why is this important to us? Well, because this is something that allows us to work on creating progressions by doing partial ranges of motion first and then building into full ranges of motion, which goes against a lot of what is taught in CrossFit, where in CrossFit, we prioritize full ranges of motion. But we prioritize full ranges of motion in our ultimate level of performance, our ideals. And one of the things that we're trying to do is we're trying to move towards an ideal through our progression. Thus, in order to achieve the best foundational movement patterns, it's important to use this principle of mid-ranges versus end ranges. And to do this by addressing the starting, transition, and finish positions. Now, the next principle here is the principle of stability. Stability can be achieved in 2 ways. One, in terms of how much contact we have with our environment. And 2, through physiological stability. The point of contact is the one that we experience when we are performing a movement with a large part of our body in contact with the floor or with a stable surface. Another more nuanced example that I share here is, if you look at the figure on the top right, is a standing position. If you stand with your feet right under your hips, notice the area that you have to balance on, the size of it. If I take that foot stance and I widen it a little bit, notice now the base of support that I have, slightly larger. And then if I move my feet all the way out, notice what happens to that base support. It may not increase in area, but you do see that it decreases in width. Which one do you think is more stable? The one with your feet all the way out, the one with your feet all the way in, or the one that is in the middle? Just something to think about. Although we stand with our feet under our hips, having a shoulder width apart stance tends to be one of greater stability. So learning how to address different shapes applied to creating greater surface areas allows us to find more stability. Using, for example, a wall, a point of contact, gives us more stability. Even when you're sitting, if you're sitting on a bench that doesn't have a backrest, you have less points of contact than having a chair or a bench that has a backrest. So if you think about creating progressions, more points of stability, more points of contact gives you a more basic level of progression. Less points of contact gives you a higher level of progression. Now, in addition to the points of contact, the physiological stability is the opportunity that exists to create muscular stability, biomechanical stability, anatomical stability. And an example of this would be, let's say you're on a set of rings and you're in a support position. Where do you think you have more stability? When your hands are close to your body or away from your body? I think it's pretty obvious that it's when you're close to your body. There are several reasons for this, but I simply want you to keep in mind that the closer you are to the midline, the more stable. The further away from the midline you are, the less stable. If you also start to look at other movement patterns, you'll realize that this also happens when you're moving from flexion to extension. We tend to have more stability in flexion than in extension. We tend to have more stability in external rotation than in internal rotation. And why this is interesting is because our physiological stability goes hand in hand with our global versus local principle for progression principle, sorry. Now, let's see, where was I? Finally, another example of physiological stability can be observed in this hang test. If you've ever attended my seminar, you know that I talk about this all the time, but let's say you're hanging from a bar, okay, and you're hanging with two arms. Hanging with two arms is very stable. 2 points of contact, and it creates nice stability in the shoulders. If I were to let go of one hand and lose that point of contact, immediately I would start to spin away. I would start to fall apart. I wouldn't have as much stability. Thus, I need to create resistance. I need to push in the opposite direction of where gravity is sending me to create the stability necessary to hold that position. And you can see this in the top figure here on the left, how in the hang test figure 01, I'm kind of spinning away. I'm losing stability. And on the second one, I'm reaching in the opposite direction. I'm resisting that rotation and that giving me stability. Although I'm not adding a point of contact when reaching forward, I am adding stability. Does this make sense? Me adding a point of contact to create stability while hanging with one arm would be having somebody holding my hand that is not holding onto the bar and pulling me in that direction. That would give me stability. That would be a point of contact. This little nuance right here is extremely powerful to keep in mind. And why is it so powerful to keep in mind? Well, because it's what's going to lead you to understanding how to create progressions that are very simple and taking any movement, regardless of how complex, and being able to transform it into a more effective one, a more efficient one. Now, the next principle, a progression principle is central versus peripheral. Central versus peripheral now is us moving away from the mechanical principle for progression and now into more of the physiological one. And this is where we focus on developing the body from the central engine first and then into the peripheral engine. What does this mean? Well, let's say you are learning how to run and you want to run a marathon. You may have the central engine that is capable of running 42 kilometers, the ability to, from a cardiovascular perspective, run the 42 kilometers, but from a peripheral perspective, from your ability to sustain the form, the control, you may not have it. So in order to progress yourself to get to running a marathon, you first need to see, where is your engine? Is your engine capable of lasting 42K in a run? If yes, because you have tested it in different forms, let's say you translate your running into, and this is not an accurate translation, but it's just an example. Let's say you took your running and you applied it to rowing, or you applied it to biking, and you realize, you know what, you could last from a central engine perspective, the duration of a 42K run. Then you have the foundation. But you may not have the muscular strength or stamina to endure the movement iterations, repetitions that is required for you to take all the steps needed to complete the 42K running. Thus, you need to progress yourself depending on where you are lacking. Most people tend to lack in one or the other. So it's identifying, where am I lacking? Is it my central engine or is it my peripheral engine? And if so, what progression am I going to create to get there? In other words, this is kind of like having a car, a vehicle, and having the engine versus the body of the car. If you put a big engine, a sports performance engine, in a little Beetle, that Beetle will potentially fall apart if you hit the gas pedal all the way down. And if you start to drive it like a sports car, that Beetle car will fall apart. Thus, it needs to be reinforced with the structures, with the peripheral systems that are going to allow that engine to translate its power into the expression. Hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. And then finally, we have the speed continuum. The speed continuum is the one of balance and motion. And this is where an example of riding a bike comes into play. And it's very simple, that riding a bike is easier to learn when you have a little bit of movement. You don't start trying to start by trying to balance on two wheels. You try to pedal. And you try to find the right speed that allows you to move with safety, efficiency, and effectiveness, where you can steer, you can control, you have a sense of stability. If you go too slow, you fall down. If you go too fast, you get the speed wobbles and also fall down. So it's finding in the speed of your motion what is right. And this is a very simple progression principle, but one that when you start to look at it, really produces great results in terms of being able to address that which is needed. And sometimes it's as simple as watching somebody perform a push-up and realizing, hey, you're moving a little too slow. No wonder it's so hard. Move a little faster. Or, hey, you're moving so fast that the mechanics are falling apart and thus will not translate into what you are actually seeking. Now, let's move from the progression principles to the progression methods. And these progression methods, I'm going to skim over because I want you to read them. And I'm just going to quickly address them. The first one is blocking. Blocking is learning how to use your anatomical body shape and applying it to any movement and realizing that when you apply the anatomical shape to any movement, that movement will elicit a movement pattern that will carry over into anything that you want to create. And a very simple test for everybody is if you get on the floor right now and get into the position that I have in the figure 2 here on the left-hand side, meaning doing a push-up with your hands flipped around this way, you'll notice that you cannot push your elbows back, you cannot push your elbows out, and you cannot push your elbows in. They remain right on top of your wrists, meaning they stay in the position that I was talking about earlier during the pushing and pulling shapes, where I was saying to create a mirror image between your push-up and your row. When you see that happen, you can start to apply this into any other movement pattern you'd like. In fact, I'm going to also include in the description of today's session a progression video that I created for this. The other expression of blocking movement is by using an external object. You can place something, for example, in this case, I have a dumbbell right behind my elbow, in order to block my elbow from moving back, in order to block my elbow into being perpendicular to the ground. By doing this, I am creating awareness in the way that I move that eventually will translate into what I need. I'm going to leave it at that for now. And then the final way of thinking about blocking is by creating distance. When we create full ranges of motion, which is something that CrossFit encourages in movement, we also create the positional standards needed to have the most effective and efficient ability to move. Now this, I can say it all day, but until you try it and work with it, you won't know what I mean. So I'm just going to share that for now, that in our progression methods, one is blocking. And blocking is probably something that we could write a full book about. But for now, I just want you to keep those in mind. 1, the anatomical blocking. 2, the external object blocking. And 3, the distance blocking. I want you to read this, and then I want you to watch the videos that I'm going to be sending out, and then apply it to your practice and see what happens. The next method is the 60% rule. What does this rule state? Well, this rule states that if you're 60% there, meaning you look, you feel, you're hitting a movement 60% of the time, I'm going to progress you forward. I'm going to go further into the progression until you're at a place where you're starting to fail. That place where you're starting to fail, that is the edge of your performance, the edge of your movement ability. Now, why am I going to do this? Well, I'm going to do this because the exploration of our edges is key. And in order to get there, I need to be willing to take a cautious risk. Thus, I want to be in a place where, although I am creating successful outcomes, I am challenging my ability by putting myself in a place where there's a high probability, like in this case, there's a 40% chance of me not making it, not being able to complete the rep, perform the movement pattern. And always doing this, of course, in a safe environment. But when I do this, all of a sudden, I will find my limits. And when I find my limits, it allows me to come in the next day and start from zero, start from a place where I am 100% successful in step 1, and then build my way up to a state where I am working with my edges, and potentially there is a chance of only 60%, a 60% rate of success. We can dive deeper into this during the Q&A. But I wanted to move a little bit so we can get to that portion. Now, the other method is position range over motion load. What does this mean? This means simply that when we work with a progression, it's important to think about moving in ranges of motion where we are capable, and then adding load and speed. This is something that you've heard many times in practice, but it's important to simply keep in mind. The next method is the simple, complex, simple method. And this one is the one that states that a simple movement pattern, such as an arm swing, can translate into a more complex movement pattern like a push-up or a dip, and eventually back into a simple movement pattern such as an iron cross. Learning how to see that an arm swing can translate into a push-up and a push-up into an iron cross is key for seeing progressions. The next one is the shift, connect, flow method. And this is realizing that the first movement that we create, whether it's doing a handstand push-up or walking, is shifting our center of mass in relationship to our base support. In this case, if you look at me right here doing a headstand, I am falling. My center mass is shifting in relationship to my base support, and that is creating movement. If you're standing up and you're about to walk, you shift your center of mass and then you move your feet. Connecting is when you begin to place one foot in front of the next. That's when you're walking. You're shifting your center of mass, and then connecting is you're moving your feet. And in a handstand push-up, for example, maybe connecting is going from a headstand and then falling, shifting into a push-up position, into a plank position. That connection gives you stability. Now, what we want to think about is how can we create fluidity from one position to the next? And that fluidity of motion is what's going to translate into what we want. So for example, in the case of the handstand push-up here, I'm standing on my head. The first thing I do is I shift my center mass in relationship to my base support. That makes me fall. As I start to fall, my head, as you can see right here, my head comes off of the ground. My points of contact change. When my points of contact change, I have the option of falling all the way back down to the ground into a push-up position, as you can see on the left-hand side, or I can flow into a handstand push-up, which you can see on the bottom right here in the figure 2. Instead of allowing my feet to come down, I shift again and I flow into a handstand. That fluidity, that little swing, that is what creates fluid movement. When we can see movement from a shift, connect, flow perspective, we can create really powerful progressions. And this is something that we can get into, and I can give you a million examples, and we can start to break them down. Now, the next one is the start, transition, finish. And this is the most simple one, the most obvious one, which is where we see in any movement pattern a beginning and an end. And when we establish our beginning and an end as an anchor, that's where now we can create the middle. And that's why this quote, build the beginning, build the end, work on the middle, is so important. And this, when you look at the start, transition, finish method, you can translate that into the shift, connect, flow method. You can translate that into the simple, complex, simple method. You can translate that into the 60% rule, and you can translate that into the blocking method. And all of those methods contain the principles that we talked about of pushing and pulling, global versus local, mid-range versus end range, stability when we're talking about points of contact, whether it's physical or physiological, and then talking about central engine versus peripheral engine, and then the speed continuum. So that is progression in a nutshell. And this, once again, although very complex in nature and with many moving parts, I'm going to share a video that kind of recaps all this, summarizes all this, that I think if you watch it will put it all into perspective. And in addition to that, as we're now translating into kind of the meat and potatoes of the book, where I'm going to be talking about the different movement patterns such as squatting, pushing, the pulling, and then combinations, this will all start to make sense. And as you put it into practice, you will be able to stress test whether these principles and methods actually hold up when you choose to integrate them. Okay, this leads us to Q&A. Does anybody have any questions, any concerns, anything that's coming up, anything that they would like to address from last week's session or from this week's session? Feel free to jump in. Madalena, go ahead.
Can I? Hello. Okay, so by reading chapter 2 and now with some of the things that you also said today, my question is refers to the also to that story of Isaac that you describe, and so it's like this: when you feel that there's something that is not working with your performance, and you are not able to pinpoint it or to find what really is wrong. Is it possible to have like some sort of systematic testing or with progressions that can help you find that? For example, because in the story that you refer, you were able to pinpoint the problem of your friend, but I imagine that he spent a lot of time trying to find it and he couldn't. But would it be possible to do it with a kind of a testing scheme that can help one find where the problem is and then work on it?
Yeah, 100%. And great question. So actually today with the progression methods, those would be a great screening protocol. So for example, let's say you're trying to learn how to do a handstand push-up, or you're trying to learn how to do a muscle up. If you took a push-up, which is the most fundamental expression of pushing, and you added the blocking movement method into it, you could see whether you are lacking strength or range of motion or stability. And thus, you can start to address it at that level and see that if it's in your push-up, if that lack of stability, range of motion, positional strength is lacking there, it probably also is lacking in that what you're trying to achieve, meaning a handstand push-up or a pull-up. And when you practice it at the most basic level and it becomes second nature for you, it becomes a movement pattern that is ingrained in your nervous system. Now it automatically translates into the outcome that you desire. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm also thinking about those kind of movements that you can also have a problem with the movement strength, but also with the skill, and that I think should be addressed differently, I imagine.
Mm-hmm. So say that one more time, the last part there, Madalena, you broke up a little bit.
I'm saying this problem may be from the movement strength point of view, but also from the skill. And that will be addressed in a different way.
Okay, I understand what you're saying now. Yeah, so the movement is the skill is the movement. Your capacity to get into those positions is what determines how effective and efficient your movement is. So it's both at the same time. And
okay.
and that's the most concise I can give you at this moment.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have a specific example of something that you are working on or thinking about right now?
Yeah, well, I'm thinking about one movement from gymnastics, for example, the front handspring. And when you keep failing the landing.
Yep.
And apparently you have done all the progressions to using, different, I don't know the name of the thing, so it's difficult to explain, but when you do it on the floor, this is the place where you should do it, you keep missing the landing, for example.
For example, are you landing short on your front handspring?
What do you mean by short?
Yeah, are you landing and your heels are hitting the ground and you're kind of falling on your butt, or you're landing and you're having to squat down? Yeah, that's the, without even seeing you, I'm like, oh, look, I know what you're failing on. That's the most typical failure that we see in gymnastics for the front handspring. And there can be many different reasons why that is happening. So instead of addressing all the different reasons, one of the things that we want to do is we want to create a progression that is going to allow you to be successful. Let's say we took blocking movement. okay? And we took the range of motion side of that, the blocking movement. One thing that we could do is we could have you do a front handspring. And sorry to everybody if I'm talking about something that you have no clue what it looks like or what it means, but just let me get through this and then maybe we can translate it. If you took the front handspring and instead of doing it to the floor, you thought about doing it off a ledge, meaning your hands were on a ledge and your feet landed like a meter down, you would most likely through that rotation land in an upright position or even over rotated. That is using the blocking system from a range of motion perspective, from a distance perspective, to give you room to complete the movement.
Okay.
Now, when doing it that way, you can now start to scale back, meaning bringing the floor higher, higher, and higher until it's almost at level to where your hands are. And in that, starting to notice, what is it that's actually missing here? Is it her heel drive that is not strong enough? Is it her lunge that is not deep enough? Is it her shoulder position that is not opening enough and thus giving her the extension that she needs? Is it the shoulder position that is not opening enough and not giving her the block to bounce off of her hands and thus give her the height to drive the heels into that position? Is it that her lunge is happening in a way that is too high, and because it's too high, it's not allowing you to get your hands down fast enough, and thus your heels are flipping before your hands touch the ground? Those are all different things. Is it her hurdle? Is it that which sets you up for the lunge that is maybe missing and needs to be addressed? Are you going too fast and thus not able to get your hands down on the ground? You see how now we're starting to get into the speed continuum. We're getting into all the progression principles. That's the skill set. But we need to start simple. We need to try to create a method that allows you to be successful, and through that success starts to stress it until that which is the most prevalent in terms of your weakness appears and we can address it.
Okay. Yeah.
Did I help a little bit?
Clear.
Help a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay, question.
Yeah.
When you do a front handspring in gymnastics, do you have somebody spotting you?
Yes.
Okay, when they spot you, are they spotting you from your shoulders?
Yes.
If they're spotting you from your shoulders, then most likely your shoulders are traveling forward in your front handspring. If your shoulders are traveling forward in your front handsprings, there's probably two reasons there it's happening. One, your hands are slow to come to the ground, meaning you have to be faster. And two, you don't have the range of motion to open up and thus create the global position that you need to get over all the way. So here, instead of thinking about the front handsprings, you could think, okay, skill transfer. What do I need to do? Well, maybe I need to work on my bridge. Maybe I need to open up my shoulders. That would be one. That is addressing position. Two, I need to develop speed from a standing position to hands down. Maybe what that looks like is like kicking up to handstand, practicing kicking up to handstand. And maybe it's kicking up the handstand not from a lunge, but from a deep lunge where your knee is on the ground. And they're noticing, oh shit, my front leg is not strong enough to drive myself over. Thus, I need to do more lunges. I need to squat a little bit more.
Okay.
You see, now you're starting to merge. And all of those little things that I shared, those are just the intuitive putting together of the principles and methods into addressing one movement pattern.
Okay.
Is that helpful at all?
Yes. Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay. Hopefully that added some color to everybody else in some shape or form. If not, I'm happy to address it with a different movement pattern. Okay. We have two questions that came through here. Sarah, you sent me one privately. Was that, is that something you want me to address? Okay, cool. Okay, closed kinetic chains in social context is also interesting. Social flexion, social extension, social internal, emotional open and connected. Cool. Okay, so yeah, there you go. So applying some of these mechanical progressions into mental and emotional ones that translates into behavior. Is that what you were kind of sharing? Yes, I totally agree with that. And that's something that we could explore in some other areas of the work that we're doing in the Insider Circle. But I fully agree. Phil said, what do you think about the learning approach of purposefully doing too much or too little in order to find the sweet spot, the perfect execution, faster than if you would just try to make it perfect every time? I remember this being mentioned in the book, Body, Mind, Master by Dan Millman, which I read a couple of years ago. Don't know the name for this approach anymore, though. I don't know the name for that approach anymore either. But I think what you're referring to is doing it perfect from the beginning rather than just being sloppy just to get through it and then trying to fix it at the end. That, although very positive, is something that can be helpful, but tends to lead to dogma. And dogma being the trap of believing that a method or a practice is the end all be all. When in reality, the end all be all is expression. And after expression, noticing the adaptations that occur, and in those adaptations start to experiment, meaning noticing, oh, what works for me, what doesn't work for me. And then taking that experimentation and taking that which really works, and that becoming the standard, that becoming the perfect execution right now, the minimum effective dose, the scaled version that's going to elicit the most amount of outcomes or the best outcome. And that becoming the practice, and then practicing that in a way that allows you to evolve or allows one to evolve, and thus getting to a point where you transcend. You no longer need that standard. You just do. You're not thinking, you're just doing. And that's when you come back to expression. And this is what we see the best gymnasts, the best athletes in the world. They do this progressive expression, experimentation, integration, transcendence in order to become the best in the world. So it's this fine balance game between what is perfect and what is enough. What is enough to get me where I want to go? And that is the individualized prescription. That's something that only you will know what it is until you do it. Thus, you need to be open to exploration and have the opportunity for collaboration with people with a different perspective or a different level of experience. Does that answer your question at all, Phil?
Yeah, a bit. Yeah, I remember reading this, like I said, a couple of years ago, and I was always wondering because I never really tried it. Like when I was just thinking about doing a jump and you want to land without falling forwards or backwards, when you're landing on a edge or something. And yeah, I was just wondering what your thoughts are. If you think this is like it's good to jump too far and fall forwards, and jump too little and fall backwards, and then you find, like I said, the sweet spot faster where you just stand there and do the jump perfectly. Yeah, faster than if you would just try to do it perfect from the beginning. That's, yeah, so yeah, kind of answered my question.
I hear what you're saying. So let's say you're doing a precision jump, okay? You're just doing a precision jump. You're jumping from one place to another, from point A to point B, and you're trying to land and stick that landing. And you're going to land on the balls of your feet with your knees slightly bent, your hips back, your chest up, and your hands forward. Okay, that's the position you're going to land in. That's your precision landing. If you did your first one and you only jumped 30 centimeters, a foot, 2 feet, it's probably going to be relatively easy, but also it may be challenging to jump so little. So you're like, well, yeah, this is a scaled version of the big thing I'm going to do up on that building, but it's at least getting me to a place where I'm doing it safely. And then you start to stretch that. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to go a meter. I'm going to go 2 meters. I'm going to go 2.5 meters. And it's in the exploration of the ranges where you start to identify what strategies you use to adjust your body in order to arrive at the destination. It's not the destination, but the strategies that you use to arrive at the destination. Thus, there is no perfect standard, only a perfect awareness of the practice of adjustment that you're making to get where you want to go. Do you see what I mean? And this is why freestyle is such an important aspect of practice, because it's the aspect of exploring within a standard that I want to achieve, where I can find my adherence to that standard. How do I best connect with that ability to move, with that expression? Yeah, okay, that adds a little bit more. Okay, we have a few more minutes. Campbell, did you have a question? I thought I saw you lift your hand, raise your hand, but maybe not.
I know we're short on time. Maybe if you just like in a general manner want to address some ways that you've had success getting people to buy into the idea of doing progressions. Sometimes that can be difficult.
Yeah, you have to trick them. It's really important to empower people and to let people show you what they want. And when you let them show you what they want, what you're really doing is you're allowing them to express themselves. And one of the most important things that you can do as a coach is to show people what they're doing, and to do it from a perspective of empowerment. Let's say somebody wants to get a muscle up, okay? And they're doing one rep after the next, just trying to get over the bar, trying to get over the rings, and they're just stubborn about doing it, and they don't want to follow a method or a practice or your recommendations. Is be like, holy shit, that's amazing. You're working really hard on getting this muscle up. Have you noticed that when you do the muscle up, there's a moment where when you're pulling, you tend to throw your right shoulder over rather than your left? Oh yeah, I have noticed that. Well, do you want to try this thing on these rings just to see if it's happening when you're doing it on the low rings or on the low bar? Yeah, let's go try it. All of a sudden they do it and they're like, oh yeah, it is happening. Oh shit. What could we do right now to avoid that from happening? And you put it on them. Well, maybe I just have to make my arc a little longer. Maybe I just have to think about not throwing my right shoulder and throwing both at the same time. Okay, and all of a sudden they do it. You're like, oh, you got that feeling? Let's take it back to the bar again. And then all of a sudden you go back to the bar, back to the rings, and maybe they succeed. If they don't succeed, this is when you have to ask, are you willing to spend a little bit more time here exploring this until your nervous system, until you adapt to doing it without thinking? Yes, I'm willing. Fantastic. Now you are on the road to progression. Empower people, allow them to guide you, and you give them the feedback that they need through your expertise. Cool. Sweet. Well, that concludes the third session. And to all of you who are here, thank you so much. I appreciate you coming through as always. I'll be posting this video later today or early tomorrow, depending on how fast the download time is. And next week, we'll continue on and we'll get into the meat and potatoes, which is part 2 now of the book. And we'll be addressing specific movement patterns. And you'll start to see how all the principles, methods, the concepts of movement ability, movement strength, skill start to translate and start to make sense. And this is where it really gets exciting, because this is where it's a little bit more simple. It's a little bit more black and white, and you can see physically what we're talking about in these concepts. All right, much love, everybody. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week. Bye, everybody. Thank you.